What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Soul Surplus Podcast, Episode 2. We are your hosts, Wes Pendleton and John Smythe. Looking forward to this topic for today. But before we get into that, John, how you doing, man?
Doing pretty good. Had a good weekend. Not too busy, you know. How was your weekend?
It was pretty good, a little restful, but, you know, as restful as can be, you know what I'm saying? When I say restful, I mean, I didn't work 12-hour days on Saturday and Sunday. I worked like 4-hour days and got things done.
Gotcha.
So yeah, man. So let's jump right into it. So this week we wanted to, or I should say on this episode, because I don't even want to relegate it to a week, because sometimes we might have multiple podcasts in a week. So I don't even want to relegate it to a weekly thing. But in this particular episode, we wanted to talk about workflows and we want to talk about some of the tips and tricks that we've picked up over the years, how we've increased efficiency, as well as just getting better at our craft. And so I guess I can let you lead, because you were the one that really wanted to talk about this. So I'll let you run point on getting us started, man.
Yeah, well, I think workflow is really underrated, and I think it's sort of the missing link between being really productive and not being productive. You know,
right.
Yeah, workflow was something I realized maybe a year or two ago, that if I invested money and time and really just my thoughts into getting a better workflow, then, you know, the sky is really the limit. Yeah, so I would like to start by talking about my own workflow.
Sure.
And so it depends on what I'm doing. As you guys know, I make the sample packs, but I also do my own productions, and also I engineer with vocalists, right. And, you know, if I have someone over here playing an instrument. So I guess the thing I do the most is production, so I'll start with that. So I am a multi-instrumentalist, so at any time I want to have my instruments ready, turned on. So that means my synthesizers, my guitars, I want to have them nearby.
Right.
I want to have all my outboard gear turned on, and I want to have Logic open. And have
right, obviously.
Right. And have all these tracks armed.
Right.
So there's a little bit of setup I have to do before I even start. So I do have a live room in here. So I go in the live room, make sure the mics are hooked up, everything is plugged into the snake. And then I come in here, make sure everything is turned on, make sure I use my template. So yeah, what does yours look like though? Because I know your approach to production is a little different.
Right. Yeah. So obviously I'm not a multi-instrumentalist. I'm pretty much, my dominant instrument would be keys. I could play a little bass, but I'm not like, you know, dominant in bass. And I used to be a drummer back in the day, so I have a pretty good handle, you know, on a set and swinging things like that, you know, that a drummer would think to do in those, you know, certain types of conditions. But yeah, pretty much like, you know, like we talked about last week, I'm primarily like a boom bap producer. So my setup is a little bit more elementary than yours. But at the same time, I feel like that my efficiency at this point really comes from like well over a decade of learning the right and wrong things to do. And honestly, I guess we can't even really say there's a right and a wrong to doing this, but right from the standpoint of when I sit down, I'd like to at least save like 10 minutes just from an efficiency standpoint, because I have certain things that I took some time out in the past to set up. So it just saves me time and allows me to just sit down and work. So one thing that I tend to do is I tend to, so if I get any new sounds, even if I'm not necessarily going to use the sounds right away, I usually load them right into Logic as soon as I get them, just because I don't want to waste time when I'm actually ready to create. I don't want to waste 20 minutes to a half hour loading sounds. You know what I mean?
That is a great idea, because I know I still have stuff that I've bought. I haven't even used it yet.
Yeah, it's still the zip file. You haven't even unbounced it yet. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, you'd be surprised. You know, this is just one of the things that I've learned in the past. Like, there's been plenty of times where I haven't loaded something and then I get the inspiration to create, and I'm like, oh shoot, I got those new drums, or I got that new sound, and it's just like, now I got to go find where the sound is at,
Right.
and then after I find the sound, then I have to load it into my sampler. And then sometimes, like, depending on where you're getting your sounds from, you might want to tune your sounds and stuff like that. So rather than doing that in the process of like at the beginning of like creating something, I actually do that like well ahead. So a lot of times I'm loading something days or weeks before I even sit down to actually use it. So that saves a bunch of time. And then also too, I actually have multiple templates and presets saved for even specific types of boom bap. So if I'm doing your traditional boom bap where the drums are really kind of more at the forefront of the track, I have a template for that. That preset tends to be just a tad more dirty, I guess you could say, from an EQ standpoint.
Yeah.
And then I also have what really is my bread and butter, which I don't really do as much as I used to in the past, but really is more of like a side chain, drums are tucked type of template where it's kind of got more of that Mad Lib, donuts feel where, the drums are there and they're present and you can hear them, but they're so tucked in the back that they're not really at the forefront.
Wow.
And then even with that, it's like, there's just a lot of side chaining with the sounds, primarily to get a good pump in the melody. And then I'm trying to think what else I have. I also have like, mastering sets for when I'm done the track, where I can just take the track that I worked on and throw it into a template and, kind of put the finishing touches on it.
Right.
But all of those things, like, man, that took me like literally 8 years just to get to that place. And so I remember, I think maybe this is back in like 2013. I think I put out like 4 beat tapes in a year. And one of the questions that I got a lot from people were like, bro, how did you manage to, to bang out that much? And, I kind of gave the answer of like, oh no, man, I was just inspired. But, really behind the scenes, it really came down to, finding sounds, collecting sounds, basically like compartmentalizing the process. So at one time, maybe I'm just finding sounds, you know what I'm saying? And so I dedicate all the time to finding the sounds. And then the next time, when I go to create, I kind of have an idea of what sounds that I want to go to use because I've heard the sounds from the day, a couple days before, a couple weeks before. And so, when I sat down and I did a tape, I literally could do a tape in like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
15 to 20 tracks. And, but it really came down to me learning like, where I'm the most efficient for my own workflow and, just implementing those things little by little.
I think it's also important to note that it took you 8 years to find something that was amazing. You can create a template and it could be garbage.
Right.
But I'm glad you talked about your drums because I was actually about to ask you that question because, man, your drums are the right amount of crispy, the right amount of dirty, and the right amount of tuck. It's really a beautiful thing.
Thanks, man. And the funny thing is, drums used to be my Achilles heel in production. And so like I remember when I first started getting into the place where, I was actually getting placements and stuff. Cause how when you first start off, you're just doing stuff in your room and you're just having fun. But then I started getting placements and actually started, getting into the big studios and stuff like that. And one of the rappers, kind of pulled me to the side and I appreciate him doing this. He's like, dude, your melodies and the way like you chop everything is great, but like your drums, they're not trash, but they definitely could use some help. And I kind of looked at him and I was just like, in the back of my mind, I was like, he's basically trying to tell me that my drums are trash and he's trying to be nice. But I appreciated him even pulling me to the side just to be honest with me, to tell me that because, basically like it was an understanding of, okay, I understand melody, but I need to take the next step of kind of getting that craft. And so yeah, it really came from like studying the greats. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later about like who we've looked towards to learn how to do those things. But yeah, man, I appreciate the compliment. Drums are kind of like, that's like the first thing that people say now about my stuff is like, bro, your drums. And it always kind of kills me because literally like 8 years ago, was the time when I got pulled to the side and was like, yo, you need to work on your drums.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it's about, though. I remember
absolutely.
I sent a beat tape to my brother. If you guys don't know my brother, shout out to him. He's Mr. Len, the legend, Mr. Len. Amazing, phenomenal producer. But I sent him a beat tape I did, and so he said, "Yeah, this sounds like music you would hear in a spa. Like, it's just kind of in the background. You don't pay attention to it."
Yeah.
And and he told me my drums were the programming was boring. So it actually really discouraged me. Mm-hmm. And I think for a few weeks even, I was a little light in what I was doing. I wasn't really creating as much.
Right.
But he told me something really important. He said that when it comes to drums, it's like drawing a face. And when people draw a face, usually they'll draw eyes, they'll draw a mouth. But people forget eyebrows.
Right.
People forget the nostrils.
Right.
And so those are the details, like the little percussive elements and, maybe not necessarily quantizing everything in the beat, maybe not perfectly quantizing your hi-hats, and then adding things that aren't downbeats, adding upbeats, those are like the details. Those are like the eyebrows of the face,
Right, right.
And I just thought that was really cool. And it definitely helped me because now I'm conscious of not even just with drums, but how I play the guitar. Am I adding things that are the upbeat? Am I just playing all downbeats? And all downbeats is not a bad thing, but
right.
It's just what the situation calls for.
Let me ask you this too. So when you're in your particular workflow, because obviously I know that we talked about this a little bit last week with how you use amps in your recording and everything like that.
Right.
Do you use those same? I'm trying to figure out what the right word would be. Do you use the same type of setup, or do you have the same type of mindset sometimes going into production that you would when you're doing more live instrumental recording?
I view it all as one, recording live instruments and production, just because it's always going to be a part of my production. As far as my settings on my guitar amp and my pedals, if you guys don't know, guitar is my home.
Right.
I am a producer. If I was to speak very honestly, before all of that, I'm a guitarist.
Right.
So when it comes to those settings, I'm the kind of person where I don't want anything to be the same, because I'm so inspired by, what happens if I, push the mids on my amp to 8 instead of 5?
Right.
Or what if I have my delay, halfway on and I set it really fast, So, and I think that's part of the reason why the packs sound so different. And the tones, while they can be similar, but there's just some wacky stuff because I keep it spontaneous.
Right.
Same thing with synths. I don't think I'm ever using VSTs for synths. Everything I do is all analog, on the hardware. So
speaking of that, make sure you guys go out and check out our latest blog post, Analog Gear. I think it's actually called Gear Corner Analog Love. John actually wrote that. John McNeil actually wrote that post. It's a really great post. We actually just posted it this morning. So make sure you guys go and check that out. But go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Check that out, guys. Analog Love. I like that.
Yeah. Because it's literally talking about like basically what you're talking about right now, and kind of like what makes us different from a lot of the other companies and brands that do sounds.
Yeah.
But go ahead. I'm sorry. Let me cut you off.
No, it's all right. And so I'm using mostly hardware and analog things in my workflow. So it's just, it's become one thing for me. And before it was sort of I was using digital as a crutch, and not that all people do, but I just know for me, because I like to work very hands-on, I would kind of feel like, oh man, this synth is just a little bit off. But it forced me to become a better musician. So as far as how those things work into my workflow, it actually makes it easier because I'm not worrying about, or I need to have this plugin on so that my filter doesn't sound this way, or all of that stuff I can just do straight on the synthesizer, and then the tone is there.
Right.
Which is the biggest thing that I love about working analog, is that you have to make those decisions, but when you do it long enough, you become confident in those decisions. So when it's time to mix, you know that everything there is the way you want it to be. You're using less plugins, using less CPU as a result. It's just this snowball effect of just making things easier for me in the way that I like to work.
Yeah, that's great, man. So is there anybody that you've looked to over the years to kind of give you some insight, or maybe like a nice little nod to how you think about your workflow and how you implement some of those things that you maybe have seen?
Well, I definitely owe a lot of the way I think about workflow to our friend Wit.
Oh yeah, man, definitely.
Yeah. When I started doing sessions with him, it was actually me, 42 North, which is John and Joel McNeil. And these would be sessions where we've got, Wit, he's doing most of the drum programming and engineering. And then you've got John, who of course is playing bass and key bass, and Joel, who is playing keys.
Right.
So now when I'm home working in my own studio, now I'm thinking, all right, so I have to be like Wit, I have to be John, and I have to be Joel. So how can I work each of these elements to the best of their ability? So
right.
one of the things that I notice whenever I work with Wit, everything in the studio is on. Every keyboard, if you touch it, even if he's not even sitting at the computer, you could just walk in and hit one of the synthesizers. Nobody's in there, but it's going to be on.
Yep.
It's going to be working. What that does is it helps inspire you, because that turns into, oh, this is a nice sound. Well, what if I just change this a little bit?
Piggybacking off of that, like how many times, because I've been in those same sessions too. Like how many times have you seen, Joel sitting down to one of the keyboards, him sitting down to one of the keyboards, and basically he's like, Joel has this thing where he literally just doodles. It's almost like it reminds me of somebody that likes to draw a lot. Joel does the same thing, and he doodles on the keyboard, and it's amazing how sometimes like he'll be going through those sounds, or and he'll find something almost by accident, and just in him playing that little, to be like a 2 to 4 bar loop, but just from that little 2 to 4 bar loop, they build award-winning production off of that 2-4 bar loop. But maybe that
Right.
maybe he wouldn't be able to do that if he wasn't just able to walk in the room and just like sit down and just play. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? Because we are talking about electronic instruments at time, or we're talking about instruments that need power, you know what I'm saying? And they need a line in sometimes for you to be able to hear it. So I've seen that happen where like, we've gone to, say like we've gone out to eat, or we've gone to play basketball or whatever, we come back into the studio and it's like we're kind of still in, slow down mode from whatever we were just doing. And Joel just sits down and gets to doodling, and then Wit is like, oh, that was fire. Right. So the next thing you know, it's like just from him just kind of just like playing on the keys, it turned into a new track. And then right after that, in the midst of them playing, like, Wit is already thinking like, oh, this can go to this particular person. You know what I'm saying? And so,
Right.
And that's another thing too. So let me ask you this: when you're creating, as a part of your workflow, do you have a particular artist or mood in mind most of the time? Like when you're creating, or are you just creating to create?
Again, that depends on what I'm doing. So I am working with an artist right now, and the feeling is more pop,
Right.
more guitar driven. So there's certain things that I go to then. And I think that is a very important thing though, because when you're creating just to create, then you can be a little more loose. But the mindset changes when you're thinking, all right, this is a little more lo-fi. So maybe I'm not gonna have this filter at 18K,
Right.
I'm not gonna have the filter all the way open and piercing.
Yeah.
And then even with that, maybe you might not go to certain sounds or certain synths. Maybe you'll stay with something like the Roadie for that.
Right.
And so then it always, like we talked about, it helps to have that on because, for me, my brain is just moving and moving and moving and moving and moving. So the moment I think this could sound good with the Roadie, I want to be able to reach over, hit a note, and be able to know, oh, maybe that does sound good or it doesn't. And then that's less time wasted on, okay, well, let me make a track. Okay, let me arm it. All right, is it on? Oh, the preamp isn't on. All right, let me turn the preamp up. Oh, it's clipping. All right, let me turn that down.
Right. Now you're like completely disrupting the creative process.
Exactly.
When you have to worry about power. It's like the dumbest thing.
Right.
It's interesting too because one of the things that I was thinking about, because you're working with this particular artist, one of the things that I find interesting is I can tell, like, over the years I've gotten to the point, I used to just be like, I'll work with anybody. But over the years, as I've gotten older, I work with less and less artists. And there's even some artists that I don't work with as much anymore. Like, this is going to kind of sound negative, but it's actually not negative. And I think that the both of us have come to a mutual understanding in this particular area. But, Tragic Hero, Tragic is one of my best friends. But one of the things about Tragic and I that are vastly different is I work extremely fast, and then Tragic will literally work on one track for 2 years. We've just witnessed it with some of the new stuff that's coming out. And so
it's amazing too. Oh, I love it.
It's weird. We don't really have as much of a working relationship now. So anything like he even comes to me and he asks for me to do now is something that he knows that I can do in like 10 minutes. So he's like, hey Wes, do you think that you could add this, or or not even just on the music side, maybe on the marketing side, do you think that you could treat this, from a color standpoint, because I like the way that you do that. That's kind of like our workflow now, is I think he understands, like, he can go to Joel and him and Joel can work on a track for 6 months, one track. Yeah. And I know that there's a max that, how long that those guys want to do that, but I look at that situation, but then I look at my workflow with Taylor when we do Middle Clash, and it's like night and day. So what Taylor says is, do whatever you want to do. I don't care, because I'm going to like whatever you do. Right. So we're able to kind of go into, if I have, like, a lot of times I'll hear something and I'm like, oh man, I think, Middle Clash would sound great doing that. And so for particular, like, if you listen to the first Middle Clash project, it has a particular sound. And it's crazy because we knocked that out very fast, but because we brainstormed and came to a conclusion of like, this is where we want to go in this particular process, we were able to knock it out in like 6 weeks. And then you fast forward to Layup Line, which was an EP that we did last year, and we knocked that out in like 4 days, right? But that's because we kind of brainstormed ahead of time, and we knew that, like, okay, this is the direction that we want to go with this. And so I think it's amazing how, even depending on the artist that you work with, your workflow is a bit different. But I would imagine, even when you're working with the person that's going to take a lot longer to finish, that workflow is especially important with that, because in essence you're wasting time, but in essence you're not wasting time, because it's just a different way of working. So I gotta imagine that when Joel and John sit down to work with Tragic, they're not brainstorming at that moment. They've already brainstormed. So when they sit down, they're creating, Right. But yeah, so I guess that's one tip we can tell the listeners. Brainstorming and kind of knowing what you're going to do before you sit down can immensely help in the process of being a little bit more efficient when you're creating. Right. So let that be number one.
Yeah. I guess this is sort of something to add on to number one. Brainstorming is very important, and in your brainstorming, whether it's for a project or even just for the day, I think you should have a goal. So if you sit down, you say, okay, I'm gonna produce today. I'm gonna make beats, or I'm gonna make specific something for licensing or whatever.
Right.
You want to have a goal for that day, because it's happened sometimes in a good way where I won't have a plan, and maybe I'll sit there for 12 hours and make a lot of great stuff, or I'm all over the place and I'm there for 1 hour, and then I get bored.
right.
And then I come back for another hour and it seems like I'm not getting much done. So I would say having a goal will definitely help you and steer you in the right direction. So maybe I'm not using this this instrument today. Maybe I'm going to be doing more mixing today.
Right.
So I don't need to turn on all of this stuff. Maybe I can just focus on, having my plugins ready, having all of the stuff I need to have ready with my computer ready.
Right. It's interesting too, because I think back when I first started, and I think about how much time I wasted because I didn't sit down with any clear goals. I just kind of woke up in the morning, was just like, oh, I think I'm going to work on some beats today.
Right.
And you sit down, and then the next thing you know, like you're looking at YouTube, you know what I'm saying, for the next like hour and a half, and then you're like, oh yeah, I was supposed to be making beats right now, and then then you try to sit down and you try to work, and then because you've gotten yourself out of the mindset of working, now it's like, man, I'm actually kind of hungry, when you're probably not that hungry. You know what I'm saying? You're just looking for something to distract you. I know, like, I kind of harped on this a little bit earlier, but like templates are so important. Like, I can't emphasize enough how important templates are.
I think that's seriously our second tip, right? Our second tip?
I think it is. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So our second tip is templates, and you'd be surprised. Like I literally have like 7 templates just for boom bap. You know what I'm saying? So I know somebody's listening, like, how can you have 7 different templates for boom bap? But there's so many different types of boom bap, right? So there's like your traditional, okay, yeah, I'm going to have hard drums, sample, and like I'm done, but then, like I said earlier, like that, I have that, but then I also have like the way I do the melodic and sidechain type of production. That's 2. But then I also have like a boom bap that's more modern. That's like a Drake, like Drake does a lot of boom bap, and I don't even think that people realize that it's boom bap. But there's a specific type of drum that they're using for that, so it's more of a modern. And I even hate to call it a modern drum, because it's not modern at all. It's an old drum. It's an electronic drum, and it's a drum from 1980 something. But it's the way that it's used now. It's not necessarily like a dirty drum. It's this really clean drum, or drums that cut right through the mix. And,
not to cut you off. I don't know if people really heard that cowbell in God's Plan. There's definitely a TR 808 cowbell.
Bro, and it's literally it's the same drum sounds that people have been using for a long time, but it's really how you place it in the mix, and it just makes a world of difference. And I understand, I don't want to get off on a tangent, I understand why people use electronic drums more now, because it just helps the mix that so much better.
Right.
There's something about electronic drums that kind of cut right through the mix, but I don't want to get off on a tangent. We can have a show about that at some other time. But I have it literally is an OVO boom bap preset, where it's more of an electronic drum preset. So I even have like a trap set that I have, and my version of trap is just a lot different than everybody else's version of trap. It's more of a trap tempo, but I still use more like boom bap drums with a trap tempo. But I tell you, saves me so much time on EQ, saves me so much time on mastering, and really kind of points to, I've been able to to develop my own sound. So when you hear, like, you know, it's mine. And even that part I think is important in template setup. When I hear Wit's production, I know it's Wit's production. When I hear Joel's production, I know it's his. When I hear your stuff, and I gotta imagine that having templates has a lot to do with that, because you're not doing massive amounts of EQ, because you kind of already know where you want to go before you start.
Right. Well, I think my templates are more just for laying things out and sort of mapping things out. So as far as individual instruments, most of the EQing I'm actually doing on the spot. I'm not doing much sound shaping in the box. I don't really use my templates for that. A lot of that, I have a hardware EQ over here, and then a lot of it is using the filters. And even I learned playing certain notes, certain notes just ring out differently. But again, that's, digressing. So for doing sample packs, I have a certain template where I have certain instruments on and armed, and I have them labeled. That's another thing I learned. Labeling the tracks in your templates is really a time saver, because you don't have to look at it and say, oh, this blue audio wave, what is this? You have to figure out what instrument it is.
Yep.
And then I have a few master bus templates, which I'm always editing. In fact, for the last pack I just finished, not the loop pack, but another one that's going to be coming out maybe this month, I have a template for that one on the master bus where I've made certain cuts on the whole, the whole thing.
Right.
And I have certain plugins on there. And yeah, so that is really where the sort of vintage EQ sound comes from the master bus. The settings I always put on the master bus. But yeah, so my use of templates is very a broad thing. It's not really, for individual tracks. But it's sort of the overall landscape of my productions,
Exactly. And even taking it a step further, just having everything noted, like, exactly what instrument it is, color coding, bro. So when you're doing music production, depending on the type of producer that you're going to have multiple tracks. I know, like, when I do production, I don't have a lot of tracks. So, I have like maybe 7 tracks at the most of the time.
Wow.
But now we're starting to get into the place where we're doing more sample creation for big companies, and like the labeling and the meticulous nature of, like, making sure that everything is named right, making sure that everything is, like, making sure that you have tails as far as, like, so, like, perfect example, like when we do loops, we never leave the wave, like, just straight we never leave the wave just as is on the timeline. There's always, like, a vamp in and a vamp out from a volume standpoint, and it's so minimum that you can't really hear it to the naked ear. But, like, Joel and I know that it's there, and it's to make sure that there's no popping, at the beginning or the end of when you can just throw it in your DAW. And you'd be surprised at, like, how much, like, when you'll go buy a pack and you'll hear stuff like that,
Yeah.
But, like, when you start to get into working with these bigger companies, the meticulous nature of making sure that everything is labeled correctly, because, then they're going to take it and they're going to throw it into, their software and stuff like that. And it's like, these are the types of things that I think if you don't go into it with the mindset of having a workflow from the beginning, then you're wasting so much time trying to correct it on the back end. And then it just becomes a nightmare, So not even just in the creation process, but just even from a professional standpoint, when you start to work with somebody else that they're going to take what you're doing and then they're going to be the ones to distribute it. Just even having the right workflow to set up before you even get started And sometimes even creating that workflow, it might take you like 5 or 6 hours just to create the workflow, just to say like, okay, we got to get all the folders labeled. We have to get all the tempos labeled. We have to get all the key signatures labeled. We have to make sure that we're labeling the drum folder the right way, the instruments folder the right way, the loops folder the right way. Like that can literally take you 3 to 4 hours.
Yeah.
Literally, we've done it, you know what I'm saying? But the amount of time that it would take to do that on the back end, if you didn't do it the right way, will literally take you a week. It's like, I've seen it, and we've had it happen, you know? And so, you know, even just like labeling and keeping in mind, like on the back end, like how many times have you heard, and I'm pretty sure you've been there, how many times do you hear producers say, man, I hate exporting files, you know, when they're done, because they have to send the stems out to the engineer so that the engineer can mix and master, you know, a record. And I'm always like, I've gotten to the point where it doesn't matter to me, because it takes me 5 seconds now to be able to do that, because I just know how to, from trial and error, from doing it the right way from the beginning, you know? So, you know, even listing and all those things, you know, can really come in handy.
I would say if you don't do that, the best time to start is now. Make that a habit.
Yep.
And I know for me, because I'm using a lot of different things, I have to label it, or else I'm going to go back and say, what the heck? Is this a guitar or is this a synth?
Right.
You know?
Yep.
And it's funny, you know, that's actually something else that I learned from Wit. When I would watch him mix, he color codes everything.
Exactly. Yep.
And I started doing that in my mixes, and it's, you know, you don't even think about it. You know, all my drums are going to be orange.
Yep.
All my synths are going to be yellow.
Right.
All my guitars are going to be green.
Exactly.
And then even from then on, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, even more so than that, it even saves you a lot of time if you make an error. So let's say, you know, let's say you worked on a project, you batch filed everything, you put it into a folder, you send it out. And then like 2 weeks later, somebody's like, hey man, I'm noticing that, you know, there's like 2 or 3 sounds that are missing that I heard in the initial, you know, demo or whatever that, you know, that you sent over. I'm actually missing those sounds. You know, is there any way you can find that? So now what happens if you have like 100 tracks and then you didn't label it and you didn't color code it? Now you're going back and you're trying to find this particular sound. It's just like, bro, I cannot find this sound. So now you have to literally listen through every track to find the exact sound or the exact instrument. Where if you would have tagged it the right way, if you would have color coded it, you could have said, so they're like, it's missing a synth. You go right to the synth section and you can say, well, which one exactly are you talking about? Well, it's this particular one right at this spot. You can go right to the time and right to the place, and you're like, oh, I forgot to add this vocoder synth into the, for some reason it didn't bounce. I'm sorry, I'll bounce that out right away. Now it's taking you literally a minute as opposed to, you know, an extra 20 minutes to a half hour, which makes you not even want to do it. You know, that's the easiest way to get a creative to stop, is to have them to go back and like they have to dig for something that they didn't have in their mindset to dig for that day. It's the worst, man.
Yeah. And you know, I think that definitely comes from learning to be an engineer. Right. Which was a big change, not necessarily change, but just something a chop I had to develop. I had to learn how to manage a session, you know, not just literally a session, but a Logic session. Right. I had to learn how to manage things, you know. So if you guys are miking your top toms, your bottom toms, you know, top of the snare, bottom of the snare, inside the kick, outside the kick, you know, overheads, rooms, you got synths, 2 mics on the guitar amp and bass, and you're not labeling that stuff. I feel bad for you.
You are in for an extra long day.
Yes.
And it really can become a nightmare.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I think that we've pretty much covered everything. One thing that I did want to actually, know it. I think we covered everything.
Did we miss a tip?
No, I think we did all tips. I think one of the tips that we forgot to say was a tip was, you just said, making sure that all your instruments are tuned, your equipment's on, everything is marked.
Oh yeah.
Because that could just save so much time.
Right.
I've seen in many engineering sessions the opposite end of when things aren't done the right way. And I've seen a lot of money and creativity wasted.
Yep.
Because time really is money in those instances, and it's just a shame to see, you're renting, if you're, and obviously a lot of us are more bedroom engineers, producers now, but there's still, those times where you're doing something big and you have to rent out a studio, and I've seen people in a $100 an hour studio session. I've seen an engineer get chewed out, because he's like, bro, what are you doing? It reminds me of the Atlanta episode this year.
Yep,
that came out this year.
Just thinking about that.
And it's funny because like a lot of people were probably watching that and thinking like, yo, this dude is really overreacted. But it's like when you're in that position, it's just like, fam, the artist shouldn't have to be thinking about that particular thing. You know what I'm saying? And
Right,
just having the right workflow, taking a few minutes before you get into a session to make sure everything is right, it just saves so much time and effort, man.
Yeah. And I think that's why certain engineers get hired at these studios and certain
Absolutely.
ones don't. It's the little things, so the people that work at Milk Boy, if you guys don't know, Milk Boy is an amazing facility in Philadelphia, right in downtown Philly. The engineers that get hired there, there's no way they're not the kind of people who don't label sessions or don't have folders for certain things.
Right.
Because once you get to that level, there's no way you can't keep track of that, because hopefully you guys want to have 50, 40 clients. That's a lot. But
I was about to say, I don't know about all that.
That's a lot of clients.
Yeah.
50 clients over a year or over a couple years. You got to keep that stuff organized. So it's better to start now. It's better to get your folders. If you got one or two artists you're working with, separate those folders. Just a personal anecdote. And this is something I'm still working on. When I send people beats or I send people tracks and say, you should write over this, then when it's time for them to actually come record it, I have to find that. And I've created so much stuff,
right,
where if I didn't remember to put it in a separate folder, it's gonna waste 5 to 10 minutes, which may not sound like a lot, but 5 to 10 minutes, even when you're not paying for it, it's just like, come on, man, let's get the show on the road. Like, I want to get this done,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Overall, it just becomes an annoyance.
Yeah.
And if you're not careful, depending on the artist, not all artists are patient. And,
right.
It can become more of a pet peeve. And they're like, I'm definitely not trying to work with that guy.
Right.
And I'll say this, and, we can kind of wrap up the session. But, one of the worst things that can happen to you, as far as like, being professional and making sure that you're labeling things and can really come back to bite you, is when you sell the same beat twice by accident.
Oh man.
And because this happened to me, like when I first started, like I, probably 2 or 3 times I've sold the same beat twice. And because I'm doing so much, I didn't even realize that I sold the same beat twice, because I told everybody to go to the same folder to listen to tracks that were in this folder. And so you have, 6 or 7, 8 artists that are listening to the same things, and they're just like, oh, I'm going to pick up such and such. And you're just like, okay, cool. Yeah, I'll send you the invoice and, this and that. And then, only to find out like what usually happens. And this is the worst part. What usually happens is like one artist will get it and they'll record and they'll put it out, and then it's out. And then it just so happens that the other artist that you sold it to, either they hear it first, or when you're going back, because now you're going back to make sure that everything is cool, because that's what you should have did in the beginning.
Right.
You hear the track and it's just like, what? I think I actually sold that twice. Now you have to go and now you have to. So it's bad enough when the artist hears the track live on somebody else's. That's the worst. But it's even worse when you have to like go to the artist and say, hey man, you know that $500 that you spent? Yeah, I actually messed around and gave that track to somebody else by accident. And it's always the track that's the most popular. And so the person has like created a single around it, and I've literally had this happen to me where somebody literally created a single and did a video and everything. And I realized that I sold it twice. So basically I had to come back almost like for pain and suffering and pay this person almost like $2,000, even though they didn't pay me $2,000 for the beat, but they spent like, they might've paid like $500 for the beat and then spent $1,500 for the video.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I can't let you take the L for that. So, kind of just like reimbursing. And then it just, now all of a sudden, now you have to make more to recoup the money that you just lost. And it's just this cyclical thing that literally all you had to do was just make sure that you were on top of things, and this would have been completely avoided.
Yep. Ouch.
Yeah. So with that being said, take these tips to heart. Keep that workflow right. Stay on top of your templates, your naming, your listing, color coding. Stay on top of, even like you said, making sure that your rigs are powered the right way. And then also just go into, each day having a goal and learn to compartmentalize your time, and you'd be surprised at how much that you can get done.
Yeah, man.
So we thank you guys for tuning in to episode 2. Make sure you go and check us out on soulsurplus.com. Check out our latest products, our latest blog posts, and definitely make sure that you're subscribing to our podcast, which can be found right now on both iTunes and SoundCloud. We will be back soon, and be back sooner than you think. Until next time, talk to you guys. Peace.
See you guys. I'm going to go read that blog post.